Hey, welcome back to WTF History, the channel where we dig into the wild, weird, and downright shocking moments of the past that make you go, wait, what? I'm your host, and today, we're diving into one of the most gruesome tales in royal history, the horrible death of Henry VIII of England. You know him as the king with 6 wives, 2 of whom lost their heads. The guy who broke with the Pope and turned England upside down. But what you might not know is how this larger-than-life monarch met an end so grotesque, it's almost hard to believe. This isn't just a story about a king. It's a tale of pride, pain, and the brutal reality of human mortality. So, grab a seat, maybe not a snack. This one's a bit stomach-churning. And let's get into the horrifying end of Henry VIII. Picture the scene. It's 1509, and Henry Tudor, born June 28, 1491, is the new king of England at just 17 years old. This guy wasn't your average prince. He was the rock star of Renaissance Europe. Tall, athletic, with fiery golden red hair and a charisma that could light up a room. He was the whole package. A Venetian ambassador described him as having an extraordinary figure and angelic countenance, basically saying he was the hottest Christian prince around. Imagine a king who could joust, hunt, play music, and throw parties that would make modern-day influencers green with envy. He was charming, powerful, and seemed destined to rule with glory, a golden boy who had the world at his feet. But glory doesn't last forever, and for Henry, the turning point came in January 1536. He's 44 now, still trying to live that young, reckless life, out jousting at Greenwich. Jousting was the extreme sport of the Tudor era. Knights charging at each other on horseback, lances aimed, trying to knock their opponent flat. It was dangerous, thrilling, and Henry loved it. But on this day, everything went wrong. His horse collapsed mid-charge, and Henry, all 6 feet something of him, came crashing down. The horse landed on top of him, and he was knocked out cold for 2 hours. 2 hours. Can you imagine the panic in the court? The king, the center of their world, lying there, lifeless, while everyone wondered if this was the end. He survived, but that accident was the moment everything changed. The fall left Henry with a wound on his right leg that would never heal. We're not talking a little cut. This was an open ulcer, oozing pus, giving off a smell so foul it could make you gag from across the room. For a king as vain as Henry, this was a nightmare. He'd built his entire image around being this majestic, godlike figure, and now his body was betraying him in the most humiliating way possible. Courtiers had to stand there, dressed in their finest silks, pretending not to notice the stench, because showing any sign of disgust could land you in serious trouble. Henry's pride was as big as his ego, and he wasn't about to let anyone see him as less than divine. But that wound did more than just stink. It changed him. Around the same time, Henry's behavior started to shift. This was 1536, the year he ordered the execution of his second wife, and Boleyn, on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. Was it just politics, or was something deeper at play? Some historians think the fall caused a brain injury, messing with his head and amplifying his paranoia and temper. The charming prince who'd once won hearts was turning into a tyrant, suspicious of everyone, lashing out at the slightest provocation. The court, once a place of music and laughter, was starting to feel like a lion's den, where one wrong move could cost you your head. And then there was his body. Henry had always been a big guy, broad, muscular, built like a warrior. But after the accident, he couldn't move like he used to. Jousting was out, hunting was out, and even walking became a struggle. So what does a king with no chill do when he's stuck sitting around? He eats, and eats, and eats some more. Court records show he was packing away about 5,000 calories a day. Think piles of red meat pies, more meat, all washed down with wine and beer. Vegetables? Barely a side note. His waist, a trim 89 centimeters in his youth, ballooned to over 130 centimeters. At his heaviest, he tipped the scales at over 180 kilograms. So heavy they had to build a pulley system to move him between rooms and widen the doorframes in his palaces just so he could fit through. For a man obsessed with his image, this was a crushing blow. The leg ulcer only got worse, becoming a constant source of agony. His doctors, working with 16th century medicine, made things even more horrific. They'd burn the wound with hot irons, thinking it would help. They slathered on mixtures of arsenic and mercury. Yep, actual poison. And don't forget the bloodletting, draining his blood to balance his humors. Spoiler, none of it worked. The ulcer grew, the infection spread, and the smell got so bad it could be detected 3 rooms away. Courtiers would douse themselves in perfume, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces, trying to survive being near the king. And Henry? He knew. He knew he was a walking biohazard, and it drove him mad with humiliation. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was reshaping his reign. The physical pain and mental strain were turning Henry into someone his younger self wouldn't recognize, and his court was feeling the effects. The man who'd once been Europe's golden prince was now a ticking time bomb, and everyone around him was caught in the blast radius. As Henry's body continued to betray him, the court became a darker, more dangerous place. That leg ulcer wasn't just a wound. It was a symbol of his unraveling, both physical and mental. By the 1540s, the king who'd once dazzled Europe was a shadow of himself, trapped in a body that was falling apart and a mind that was spiraling into chaos. The accident in 1536 had set off a chain reaction, and now the fallout was in full swing. Let's dive into how Henry's decline turned his court into a pressure cooker, his paranoia into a deadly weapon, and his personal life into a tragic mess. The ulcer on his leg was now a festering disaster, oozing, infected, and giving off a stench so vile it could clear a room. Imagine being a courtier, dressed in your finest velvet, forced to stand there while the smell of rotting flesh hits you like a wall. You couldn't flinch, couldn't cover your nose, because Henry's ego was as fragile as his health. One hint of disgust, and you might find yourself facing his wrath, or worse, the executioner's axe. The court was a place of whispers and fear, where everyone was playing a deadly game of pretend. Acting like their king was still the majestic figure in those grand portraits. But those paintings with Henry standing tall, hands on hips, were pure fiction. The real Henry could barely walk, his massive frame hoisted around by a pulley system like some kind of royal cargo. His physical decline was matched by a mental one. That possible brain injury from the jousting accident was taking its toll. Henry had always been impulsive, but now he was erratic, suspicious, and terrifying. He started seeing enemies everywhere, friends, advisors, even family. Take in Boleyn's execution in 1536. It wasn't just about her failing to produce a son. The charges of adultery and treason were flimsy, likely cooked up to justify Henry's desire to move on. But after her, the executions kept coming. Thomas Cromwell, his loyal advisor who'd helped him break with Rome, was beheaded in 1540 on vague charges of treason and heresy. No trial, no mercy. And just days before Henry's own death in 1547, he ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, over some half-baked suspicion of plotting against the crown. The court was a snake pit, where one wrong word or glance could land you on the scaffold. Henry's paranoia wasn't just about politics, it was personal. He became obsessed with poisoning, convinced someone was trying to slip something into his food. He set up this elaborate system where every dish was tasted by servants before it reached his table, and every utensil was inspected like it was a murder weapon. Was he right to be paranoid? Maybe a little. He made plenty of enemies, from nobles who'd lost power to Catholics furious about his break with Rome. But a lot of it was in his head, possibly fueled by many strokes or that brain injury. Whatever the cause, it turned the royal court into a place of constant dread, where everyone was watching their step. His physical state was making things worse. At over 180 kilograms, Henry was a logistical nightmare. His diet, 5,000 calories a day of meat, pies, wine, and beer, wasn't helping. His doctors kept trying their brutal treatments, burning the ulcer with hot irons, rubbing in toxic ointments, draining his blood. None of it worked. The wound got so bad you could see the bone through the rotting flesh, and the smell was unbearable. Courtiers carried perfume-soaked handkerchiefs, not just to mask the odor, but to keep from passing out. Henry's pride took a beating. He knew he was a spectacle, and it fueled his rage and despair. His personal life was just as grim. After Boleyn's execution, he married Jane Seymour, who gave him his son Edward but died in childbirth. And of Cleves came next. A political match he annulled because he didn't find her attractive. Ironic, given his own state. Then came Catherine Howard, a 19-year-old who married a 49-year-old Henry in 1541. By this point, he was obese, barely mobile, and reeking from his leg wound. Can you blame Catherine for looking elsewhere? When Henry found out about her affair, he had her and her lover executed. His final wife, Catherine Parr, married him in 1543 and became more nurse than spouse, dressing his wounds and managing his moods. Even she wasn't safe. Henry once considered arresting her for heresy over a theological debate. It was a marriage born of duty, not love, and it showed how far he'd fallen. The court was a bizarre mix of grandeur and decay. Henry insisted on lavish banquets and extravagant clothes, trying to maintain the image of a powerful king. But the reality was impossible to hide. The smell of his rotting leg filled every room, and his massive size made him a spectacle. Modern experts think he had diabetes, gout, hypertension, maybe heart failure. Some even suggest syphilis, though that's debated. Whatever the mix, he was in constant pain, alternating between screaming fits and eerie silences where he'd stare into space for hours. The court, once a place of celebration, was now a stage for a dying king, with everyone pretending he wasn't falling apart. By the mid-1540s, Henry's reign was a shadow of its former glory. His paranoia and executions had depleted the court of talent and loyalty, and his obsession with a male heir had reshaped England, breaking with Rome, dissolving monasteries, creating the Anglican Church. But as his body failed, so did his grip on the myth of his own invincibility, pulling his court deeper into a world of fear and uncertainty. By late 1546, Henry's life was a living nightmare, and the court was holding its breath. The king who'd once been Europe's golden boy was now a wreck, his body and mind crumbling under the weight of disease and paranoia. The leg ulcers that had plagued him for a decade were now a full-blown catastrophe, with gangrene setting in, turning his flesh into a rotting mess. The pain was relentless, sharp, burning, enough to make him scream so loudly it echoed through the palace. But he wasn't screaming. He'd sink into these haunting silences, staring into nothing, lost in a fog of pain and delirium. The court, once a place of music and grandeur, was now a grim stage where everyone was just waiting for the inevitable. The smell was beyond horrific. That festering ulcer gave off a stench so bad it could make you gag from 3 rooms away. Courtiers were practically bathing in perfume, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces to survive being near the king. His massive body, over 180 kilograms, was swollen with fluid, his legs so bad he could barely stand, even with help. His breathing was labored, likely from heart failure, and he was running constant fevers, probably from sepsis as infections spread through his blood. His doctors kept up their useless treatments, hot irons, toxic ointments, bloodletting, but it was like trying to fix a sinking ship with a bucket. The wound was so severe you could see the bone, and the gangrene was eating away at him while he was still alive. Henry's mental state was just as dire. He was slipping in and out of delirium, muttering incoherently, sometimes calling out the names of his dead wives. Jane Seymour, who'd given him his son Edward, seemed to haunt him most, maybe because she'd succeeded where others hadn't. Some accounts even say he mentioned in Boleyn, the wife he'd sent to the scaffold. Was it guilt creeping in, or was just his fevered mind playing tricks? We'll never know, but it's chilling to imagine. His paranoia was at an all-time high, and he was still ordering executions. Just days before his death, he had Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, beheaded on flimsy charges of treason. It was like Henry was trying to assert control over a world that was slipping away, lashing out at anyone who crossed his path. The court was in a bizarre state of denial. In Tudor England, saying the king was dying was treason punishable by death. So even as Henry's body was literally rotting, his physicians and courtiers kept up the charade that he'd recover. They talk about his robust health, while the smell of decay filled the air, a grim farce that everyone had to play along with. Behind closed doors, they whispered, covering their noses, but no one dared speak the truth. It was a surreal scene, a king falling apart, surrounded by people pretending he was fine because the alternative was too dangerous. Henry's final marriage to Catherine Parr was a lifeline in this chaos. She was smart, patient, and took on the role of nurse, tending to his wounds and managing his moods. But even she wasn't safe. There's a story that Henry once considered arresting her for heresy because she dared to debate theology with him. She talked her way out of it, but it shows how volatile he'd become. The court was a pressure cooker, with everyone tiptoeing around a king who could explode at any moment. His obsession with poisoning was still in full force. Every dish tasted, every utensil inspected, reflecting a mind that saw enemies in every shadow. By the winter of 1546 to 47, Henry was at his lowest. He could barely move, even with the pulley system. His fevers were constant, his pain unbearable. The palace was a place of miasma and dread, with courtiers dreading every summons to the king's side. Henry seemed to sense the end was near, making arrangements for his 9-year-old son, Edward, to take the throne under a regency council. His obsession with securing his dynasty was the one thing keeping him going, but even that was fading as his body gave out. On January 27th, 1547, Henry made his final move. Too weak to speak, he called for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, one of his few remaining allies. When asked if he died in the Christian faith, he squeezed Cranmer's hand, a last gesture of defiance against the chaos of his body and mind. In the early hours of January 28th, at 55 years old, Henry VIII took his last breath, bringing an end to a reign that had reshaped England. The king was dead, but the horror wasn't over. Henry's massive body, over 180 kilograms, posed a gruesome challenge for the embalmers. Tudor embalming was crude. Remove the organs, stuff the body with herbs, and hope it holds together. But Henry's corpse was already decomposing, ravaged by gangrene and infection. They built a special coffin to contain his frame, but it wasn't enough. While the coffin sat in the chapel at St. Abbey, waiting for the state funeral, it started to leak. The gases and fluids of decomposition seeped out, dripping onto the chapel floor. And then came the moment that's gone down as one of the most revolting in royal history. Stray dogs were found lapping up the putrid liquid. The man who'd spent his life projecting divine majesty, who defied the Pope and executed wives, ended up as a meal for street animals. It's the kind of detail that makes you stop and say, "History, what are you doing to us?" The funeral on February 16th, 1547, was as grand as you'd expect for a king like Henry. He was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour, the wife who'd given him his son. But even the pomp couldn't hide the reality. The smell from the coffin was so bad it nearly overwhelmed the mourners, despite all the incense and flowers. It was a final, humiliating reminder of how far Henry had fallen, from a prince compared to an angel to a corpse that couldn't even be contained. This wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of a myth. Henry's reign had been a whirlwind, breaking with Rome, creating the Anglican Church, dissolving monasteries, executing wives and advisors. He'd reshaped England in ways that still echo today, but at a cost. His obsession with a male heir led to Edward VI, a sickly boy who'd die at 15, passing the throne to Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and then Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth would go on to rule a golden age, but Henry never could have predicted that. All his schemes, all his cruelty, were for a legacy that didn't go as planned. And his gruesome death was a stark reminder of the limits of his power. What does Henry VIII's story leave us with? It's a tale of pride, power, and the brutal reality of human mortality. He started as a prince who seemed invincible, a man who could bend the world to his will. But that jousting accident, that festering wound, that spiraling paranoia, it all brought him low. His death, with its leaking coffin and scavenging dogs, is almost poetic in its horror. The king who'd lived for majesty ended in the most undignified way possible. It's a reminder that no matter how much power you have, your body can betray you. Nature doesn't care about your crown or your conquests. It comes for us all. This story grabs us because it's so human. Henry wasn't just a king. He was a man undone by his own flaws, his own mortality. His decline wasn't just about a failing body. It was about a man losing his grip on the myth he'd built. The paranoia, the executions, the desperate quest for a son. It all paints a picture of a king fighting a losing battle against time. And that leaking coffin? It's the ultimate reality check, showing that even the mightiest fall to the same fate as the rest of us. But Henry's legacy isn't just about his end. He changed England forever, breaking with Rome, creating a new church, reshaping the nation's politics and religion. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, carried his legacy forward, with Elizabeth building a golden age that Henry could only dream of. It's ironic. The man who executed in Bullen gave the world Elizabeth I, one of history's greatest rulers. His life was a paradox, a mix of triumph and tragedy, power and pathos. And that's why we're still talking about him centuries later. This is what history does. It shows us the messy, human side of the people who shaped our world. Henry's story is a wild ride, from golden prince to rotting tyrant. And it's a reminder that no one escapes the limits of the flesh. His death wasn't just an event. It was a symbol of the fragility of power, the inevitability of decline. It's why we love digging into these stories, not just for the shock value, but for what they tell us about ourselves. Thanks for joining us on this gruesome journey through the horrible death of Henry VIII. If this wild tale of power and decay blew your mind, hit that like button, subscribe to WTF History, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the past. We've got more shocking stories coming, from bizarre royal scandals to forgotten moments that'll make you gasp. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you thought of Henry's story or what historical figure you want us to tackle next. Until then, keep questioning the past, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, folks.